Welcome, traveller, to this quiet space. You have found your way here once again, not to a sanctuary of forests or whispers, but to one built of stone and silence, hidden in plain sight. We are standing on a cobblestone street, perhaps in your own city, surrounded by the hum of a world that believes it knows its own past. But here, in this contemplative quiet, we will allow that certainty to fade. There is nothing for you to solve tonight, nothing to prove. Your only task is to listen, to let the weight of the day dissolve, and to drift with me as we gaze upon the monuments that surround us. The buildings we have been told are our heritage. We are going to explore the enigmas of our own cities, the questions that linger in the very foundations beneath our feet, the mysteries carved into the facades that tower above us tonight. We ask a simple, gentle question. Who truly built the world we inhabit? We are told a comforting and familiar story about our history. It is a story of gradual progress, of nations rising and falling, each developing its own unique identity, its own language, its own culture, and its own distinct architectural footprint. We are shown pictures of ancient Rome, of medieval Paris, of Victorian London, and we are assured that these styles are the unique products of the people who inhabited those lands. History books are filled with the names of kings and conflicts, of architects and revolutions, each painting a picture of a world defined by separation, by competition, and by isolated development. We are told that the grand structures in our capitals, the banks, the state houses, the courthouses, and the libraries, are the proud achievements of our recent ancestors, built in the 19th and early 20th centuries, as testaments to their newfound industrial power and civic pride. This is the story written in our textbooks, a narrative of human ingenuity emerging, piece by piece, nation by nation. And it is a beautiful story. But as we stand here, in this quiet space of contemplation, letting our minds float above the globe, we find ourselves asking, is it the whole story? As we let our gaze drift from continent to continent, the official tale begins to feel thin, like a veil that shimmers in the twilight. Let us not be so quick to accept. Let us instead simply wonder. Let us begin our journey in Buenos Aires, the capital of Argentina, at the turn of the 20th century. We see streets adorned with buildings of astounding grandeur, a symphony of monumental columns, intricate facades, and enormous arched windows, all designed in a single imperial style. It speaks of the highest level of engineering, a unique face for a great South American city. But then, let us leap thousands of miles to another continent, to Kiev in Ukraine, or to Pittsburgh in the United States, or to Frankfurt in Germany. We find ourselves, astonishingly, surrounded by nearly identical architectural masterpieces. The languages change, the cultures change, the climates change, but the stone remains the same. The style is universal, as if cast from a single forgotten blueprint. This is the first paradox. The silent stone giants in the centres of our world tell a very different story than the one in our books. They do not speak of isolated nations and unique paths. They stand as irrefutable proof of a global, unified civilization, one whose standards and aesthetics were the same from Australia to Canada, from Russia to Argentina. These are not just similar structures. They are precise copies, united by a common design and a shared advanced technology. This raises the first unsettling question. Why is the architectural code embedded in the foundations of the world's capitals so universal? Why, despite all the supposed linguistic and cultural barriers, do buildings at opposite ends of the earth speak the same monumental language? Whose will or what forgotten technology lies behind this global project? And who exactly left us this grand, silent legacy, one that our history books seem so reluctant to discuss. This mystery only deepens as we drift closer. Let us float down from our global view and stand at the foot of one of these magnificent structures. Let us look past the unified style and observe the scale. It is here that a profound and unsettling feeling begins to creep in, a sense of deep architectural dissonance. Our focus shifts from the grand majesty of the building to its individual elements, and we realise that the proportions are all wrong. Look at the entryways. These are not just doors. They are gargantuan portals, their height and width 2 or even 3 times that of an adult human. The massive leaves of wood and metal seem designed not for us, but for beings of a completely different size. For an ordinary person, using such an entrance is not just inconvenient, it is absurd. The handles are often placed too high, the sheer weight of the doors requiring an effort that seems almost inhuman. We feel small, not in a metaphorical sense, but in a literal one. This feeling continues as we look up. The windows' vast arched openings often begin at a level far above our heads, soaring upwards to light halls whose ceilings are lost in the unreachable heights. They are not windows designed for a person to look out upon the street. They are light apertures for spaces designed on a completely different scale. The walls themselves are constructed from giant blocks of stone, each weighing tens of tons, fitted together with a precision that defies our understanding of primitive tools. A single person, standing against this backdrop, seems no larger than an ant. The columns that support the vaults are so massive that it would take 3, perhaps 4 people to encircle them with their arms. We are left with the persistent nagging feeling that we are like Lilliputians who have stumbled into a land of giants, trying to adapt their colossal world to our own modest needs. This thought, this sense of being an accidental guest in a world not built for us, finds a strange and unexpected echo in the old chronicles. We look again at Argentina, where our journey began, and we remember the tales of Patagonia, a region known for centuries as the land of giants. Ancient reports and even photographs have survived, capturing local inhabitants standing next to Europeans. The difference in height astounding. We have always dismissed these as myths, as sailors' tales. But what if they were not? What if the architecture is the evidence? What if these proportions were not the result of mindless gigantism, or a simple quest for imperial grandeur? What if all these elements were calculated precisely and ergonomically, but for beings of the very height spoken of in those legends? For them, these giant doors would have been ordinary doors. These high ceilings would have been a comfortable, normal living space. This single thought fundamentally changes our perception of reality. We cease to be the masters of these cities, and we become their inheritors. We are squatters, living in the magnificent, silent, and impossibly large shells of a civilization that came before us. But this realization, as profound as it is, only gives rise to the next, even deeper question. If the very scale of these buildings was designed for other beings, then perhaps their function was also completely different from what we have been led to believe. What if the places we now call theatres, banks, and cathedrals were never intended for performances, financial transactions, or prayer at all? The mystery of these disproportionate buildings, these silent stone giants, becomes even more perplexing as we turn our attention to the most common and recognisable among them all across the globe. In every city we have just observed, we find them standing like silent sentinels. We call them churches, cathedrals, temples, and mosques. They are united not only by that same curious global architectural style, but by a striking set of identical design features that seem to defy their given purpose. We are told a simple story. These are places of worship, centres of spiritual life, built by pious men to honour a god. We are told the soaring vaults are meant to lift the spirit. the domes to represent the heavens, the tall spires to reach toward the divine. This is the story we have always known, the one that fills the quiet halls with the scent of incense and the echo of prayer. It is a story of faith, a story of the metaphysical. But as we rest here, in this quiet, logical space, let us set aside the interpretations that have been given to us. Let us, just for a moment, look at these structures not from the perspective of a theologian, but from the perspective of an engineer. Let us set aside the metaphysical and look only at the physical, at the cold, hard facts of their construction. When we do this, a completely different and truly astonishing picture begins to emerge. What if their purpose was never spiritual at all? What if their true function was purely and profoundly technical? Let us consider their key elements, those features that are repeated with such impossible consistency across the entire planet. Let us begin with the dome. We are told it is a symbol of the heavens, but from a standpoint of pure physics, it is a perfect resonator. It is an acoustic and energetic concentrator, designed to gather, focus, and amplify waves. Often, as we look at old plans, we find these domes were reinforced with intricate metal frames, or even coated in metal, a feature that would only enhance their potential electromagnetic properties. Then, let us lift our gaze to the spires, the minarets, and the bell towers that pierce the sky. We are told they are an attempt to be closer to a god, but to an engineer, they look like something else entirely. They look like perfect antennas. They are gigantic needles, often placed at the highest point, designed to interact with the sky, perhaps to capture atmospheric electricity, to draw energy from the vast field that separates the Earth from the ionosphere. And what of the crosses that sit at their peaks, or the intricate metalwork on the crescent? Let us look at the older, more complex versions. They do not look like simple symbols. They look like multi-beam terminals, like wave emitters, or perhaps complex dischargers, a kind of receiver designed to interface with this energy. We look at the great rose windows, those magnificent circles of complex fractal geometry. We are told they are for beauty, to inspire awe. But what if their geometry was functional? What if they were designed to modulate specific frequencies of sound or light, to tune the energy within the structure? When we look at all these elements together, the resonating dome, the antenna-like spire, the terminal at its peak, the frequency modulators in the windows, the building ceases to look like a house of worship. It begins to look like a highly complex technical device. It looks like a gigantic machine, where every single element performs a precise, calculated function in a unified process. This leads us to a logical yet radical hypothesis. What if these structures were not temples of faith, but power plants? What if this was a global network of advanced machines designed to generate, gather, and transmit free wireless energy from the environment, from what the ancients called the ether? What if the very stones were designed to hum with a power we can no longer hear? Imagine, for a moment, what these vast halls must have been like in their original form. Imagine these immense resonant rooms with their perfect soaring acoustics, but without any of the religious paraphernalia we see today. Imagine them empty, devoid of pews, devoid of icons, devoid of altars, devoid of pulpits. All of that, perhaps, was added much, much later. Perhaps it was added by a new, confused humanity, a humanity that found these silent, incomprehensible, and defunct technical facilities and tried to repurpose them to give them a new meaning that fit their new, simpler world. Perhaps people did not come here to pray. Perhaps they came here, quite literally, to recharge. Perhaps they came to use the output of this great power installation to bathe in its healing frequencies, or to draw energy for their homes and their lives. The true chasm between that civilization and our own becomes painfully clear when we simply compare what we build today with what they left behind. Look at an ordinary modern wall, a wall built to our proportions. It is made of simple bricks, or cinder blocks, or poured concrete. It is simple, it is functional, and it is understandable. Its purpose is clear, to provide shelter. It is honest in its simplicity, and it perfectly matches our current technological level. Now, mentally return to the walls of those old cathedrals or those old banks. Return to the walls assembled from perfectly fitted, multi-ton blocks of solid granite, stacked with a surgical precision that we would struggle to replicate even with our most advanced machinery. The difference is not just in scale or in beauty. It is a difference in concept. It is a difference in technology. It is a difference in the very understanding of the laws of physics, of materials, of logistics. It is like comparing a child's simple stick drawing in the sand to the detailed, annotated blueprint of a quantum computer. This observation, this vast, undeniable gap in understanding and capability, leads us to an unavoidable and truly alarming conclusion. If a global network of clean, wireless, and likely free energy really did exist, if it powered a civilization of giants, enabling them to build these impossible structures, then what happened to it? Why was there such a catastrophic, unthinkable rollback in our history? Why did humanity return to the primitive, dirty technologies of horse-drawn power and burning wood? Why, today, do we pay for every single kilowatt of electricity? An electricity that is transmitted through a clumsy, inefficient and ugly tangle of wires. Why do we fuel our world with combustion when it appears our ancestors, or the ones who came before, possessed something immeasurably more advanced, more harmonious and more powerful? If this hypothesis of a global energy grid is correct, if these silent cathedrals and grand columned banks were indeed technical installations, then they must have powered a civilization. They must have fueled the daily life of the cities they anchored. And it is here, as we drift away from the stone walls and into the photographic archives of the late 19th century, that we find the evidence for this, hiding in plain sight, captured in old daguerreotypes and faded images that paint a startling, almost fantastical picture of a world we think we know. We are shown a world on the cusp of our own, yet it feels entirely different. On the streets of Buenos Aires or Pittsburgh, or even in the dusty towns of a nascent Texas, we see elegant, silent streetcars gliding along tracks, but with a baffling, impossible detail. They have no overhead wires. They move as if by magic, powered by an unseen source. We see early, sophisticated models of electric automobiles and even strange two-wheeled contraptions that resemble modern electric scooters. It was, by all appearances, an era of clean, efficient, and widely available electricity. The cities were lit, transportation was running, and it all appears to have been part of a single, highly advanced and seamlessly integrated technological system. But then, as we flip the page in the archive, something inexplicable happens. A true historical paradox. Just a few years pass, a single decade, and the 20th century begins. Those very same streets, captured in photographs from this new era, are transformed. They become a morass of mud, a chaotic scene filled with horses, primitive carts, and the filth of animals. The elegant electric motors vanish. In their place, we are given 1 horsepower. This is not a simple change in fashion. This is not a gradual evolution of technology. This is a catastrophic regression. This is a step backward so profound that it contradicts the very logic of progress, the very narrative we have been told. Why would a society that had already mastered advanced, clean, and silent electric engines suddenly and voluntarily return to a mode of transport that was archaic, dirty, slow, and inefficient? In some photographs, we even see people posing proudly, next to their simple horse-drawn carts, a strange, almost childlike pride, as if this primitive tool were a great achievement, as if they had no memory of the silent, powerful machines that had glided down those same streets only years before. There can be only one answer to this paradox, an answer that our quiet logic, however unsettling, must force us to consider. This was not a natural process. It was not a choice. It was a deliberate act. This is the hypothesis of the Great Shutdown. It suggests that at a certain unrecorded moment, the global free energy grid was forcibly and catastrophically deactivated. Its source, the very hum that resonated within those stone cathedrals, was cut off. And in that instant, all the technologies that ran on it, all the silent streetcars and the glowing city lights, became useless junk. The streetcars stopped dead on their tracks. The city lights went out. Humanity, in a single moment, was thrown backward in its development, plunged into a new and far more primitive dark age. But why? Why would anyone do this? The answer, perhaps, lies in the very nature of that lost energy. If it was free, if it was available to all, and if it required no wires to transmit, then it was a form of energy that was impossible to control. It was impossible to meter. And most importantly, it was impossible to sell. It was a technology that granted true independence, true freedom, to every individual who had access to it, and to bring humanity under control, to build the new systems of power and commerce that we know today. That independence had to be taken away. The old system, the free system, was forced into oblivion. It was declared inefficient. It was declared dangerous. Perhaps, as the new occupants of the cathedrals would later claim, it was even declared heretical. And then, a generation later, when the memories of the silent streetcars had faded, when the generation that knew the old world had passed away, humanity was gifted new electricity. But this was a completely different technology. This was a centralized, controlled, and inefficient system. It required giant, polluting power plants, and it entangled our cities in a vast, ugly web of copper wires. And most importantly, it came with a meter, a small box placed in every single home to measure every spark humanity was given back the fire. But this time, we were told we had to pay for it. This was the great technological deception, the act that allowed for the creation of a system of total control and the complete commercialization of energy. Such a global operation, however, such a replacement of an entire planet's infrastructure, could not have happened without a trace. It left behind thousands of giant silent witnesses, the useless, empty buildings, the power plants we mistook for churches, the bridges and the grand halls that the new, weakened civilization could neither build, nor operate, nor even properly explain. To hide a crime of this magnitude, a crime against all of humanity, it was not enough to simply cut the power and rewrite the textbooks on physics. A far greater problem remained, a problem carved in stone and towering over every major city on Earth. The silent witnesses, the grand, impossible buildings themselves. The new masters of this reverted, simplified world, the ones who now controlled the metered electricity and the horse-drawn carts, were faced with a profound logistical and historical challenge. The new, weakened civilization, with its primitive tools and forgotten knowledge, could neither build such structures nor even properly explain them. To leave them unexplained was to invite questions, to allow memory to linger, to allow the new blank slate generation to wonder what giants, what masters of technology had come before them. This was an intolerable risk, and so a new narrative was required. An illusion of continuity had to be crafted with the utmost care. The new inhabitants of this world, the inheritors of these colossal, silent structures, had to be convinced that these buildings were not inherited at all. They had to be made to believe that these magnificent works were the product of their own direct ancestors. They had to be convinced that it was they, with their simple hands, their new steam engines, and their profound civic pride, who had raised these mountains of stone. A new history had to be invented, a history that claimed this impossible legacy as its own. And for this, a powerful and at the time revolutionary tool was employed. The photograph, the camera, that supposed mechanical eye of truth, was turned into the greatest tool of historical falsification the world has ever known. Archives all across the world were suddenly filled with these images. We have all seen them. We are shown hundreds of photographs, supposedly capturing the grand construction of these imperial structures in the 19th and early 20th centuries. We see men in boater hats and simple work clothes, posing for the camera against the backdrop of what appear to be grand construction sites. We see flimsy wooden scaffolding, like spider webs, clinging to the massive stone facades. We are shown these images in our textbooks, in our museums, and in our documentaries, and we are told, this is the proof. This is how we built our world. These images are meant to convince us, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that it was these men, with their primitive winches, their simple pulleys, and their horse-powered cranes, who erected these architectural masterpieces from the ground up. And it is a convincing story until we do what we are doing here tonight, until we set aside the official caption and simply, quietly look. Let us drift closer to these photographs, and let us use the same gentle, persistent logic we applied to the buildings themselves. A shocking pattern, a profound and repeating anomaly begins to emerge. In nearly every single one of these official construction photographs, the same inexplicable stage of work is depicted. We are looking at a building that is already fully and completely erected. The walls are up, the massive columns are in place, the complex load-bearing arches are already formed and settled, often even the roof is already on, and the structure is fully enclosed. The flimsy wooden scaffolding, that scaffolding we are told is for construction, is merely leaning against the finished solid facades, and the men upon this scaffolding, let us look at what they are truly doing. They are not lifting multi-ton blocks. They are not operating great machines. They are painting. They are plastering. They are installing small decorative elements, or most often, they are simply posing, holding a hammer or a shovel, looking at the photographer. We are being shown, in every single instance, the final cosmetic stage of finishing work, or perhaps the first stage of a simple repair. A deafening silence emanates from these photographs. We are shown the painting, but we are never, not in a single one of these pictures, shown the true titanic work. Where are the photographs of the ground zero phase? Where are the images of the giant yawning pits being dug for the foundations that would have to be colossal to support the weight of these stone giants? Where is the process of pouring or laying these massive unseen foundations? Where are the photographs of the multi-ton stone blocks, those impossible blocks we see in the walls, being quarried, being transported, and most importantly, being hoisted hundreds of feet into the air? It simply does not exist. The entire recorded history of these buildings' construction begins, conveniently, only after they are already standing. This is not a chronicle of construction. It is a staged play. It is, in itself, a theatre of the absurd, a massive, global falsification. The people who discovered, inherited, and reoccupied these cities needed to create a myth that they were the builders, and so they organised photo shoots, simulating bustling activity against the backdrop of the existing ancient structures. They built what was already built. The height of this grand theatre, the most audacious act of this historical deception, was the phenomenon of the so-called World's Fairs, which were held with great international fanfare around the globe at the turn of the century. Let us look at the Pan-American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, in 1901. The official story is that for this single temporary event, an entire city of the most magnificent imperial buildings of incredible beauty and complexity was erected in just a few months. We are shown photographs of a wonderland of grand plazas, towering spires, intricate palaces, canals, and breathtaking electrical illumination. And then we are told the most absurd part of the story, that all of this splendour, this city that rivaled Rome, was made of plaster and wood, like a temporary movie set, and that after the fair ended after just a few months, it was all completely demolished and thrown away. This is the official story. But as we rest in our quiet logic, we must ask, does this make any sense? The structures in the photographs look absolutely solid, permanent and real. Is it truly believable that humanity, a civilization that we have just seen regress to using horses for its daily transportation, suddenly gained the godlike ability to build such grandiose, monumental complexes out of plaster and sticks, just for temporary entertainment? Or is there a more plausible, a more logical, and a more disturbing hypothesis? What if these exhibition cities were not built from scratch at all? What if the organisers of these fairs, these new controllers of history, had simply found them? What if they found existing, perhaps partially ruined or abandoned, cities of the previous giant civilization? What if they performed a quick cosmetic restoration, plastered over the ancient stone, put up new paint, installed their new wired metered lighting, and then presented this ancient inherited wonderland to a baffled public as a miracle of modern technology? And then, after the event was over, the dismantling was nothing more than a cover story for their deliberate destruction, a way to hide the evidence once again, to dynamite the past and ensure that these silent witnesses could never tell their true story. We are not looking at photographs of construction. We are looking at photographs of a cover-up. We are looking at a world where not only technology, but history itself was stolen, appropriated, and rewritten. The grand cities, built by a highly advanced civilization, were claimed by a new one. Their purpose was changed, their power was shut off, and the memory of their true creators was meticulously and systematically erased. But this grand global deception, this appropriation of an entire world's infrastructure, leads us to the most fundamental, the most personal, and perhaps the most terrifying question of all. If this advanced global civilization of giants was the true builder, if their power was shut down and their history was systematically erased and rewritten to become our own, then who exactly are we? If the people in those stage photographs, our supposed great-grandparents, were merely the first wave of inheritors, the actors in a grand play of construction, then where did they come from? Where did we come from? As we turn our gaze from the cold stone and the metal and look instead at the faces of the people captured in those same old photographs, the feeling of unreality, of deep dissonance, only intensifies. These men, women and children who inhabited the newly claimed cities of the past, they seem to be representatives of some other humanity. It is not just the unfamiliar clothing, or the stiff formality of their poses, or the grainy quality of the images. It is something deeper, something in their features, in the very structure of their faces, in the profound and piercing expression of their eyes. They seem to be looking at the world, at the photographer, from another reality entirely. Their gazes often lack the emotions, the casual flicker of life that we are so used to seeing. They are static, serene, and unsettlingly direct, as if they are posing not for a momentary photograph, but for eternity, This anthropological dissonance, this feeling that we are looking at a people who are somehow fundamentally different, becomes even more apparent as we move from individual faces to the global picture of humanity. We are told a simple story of our origins, of a single root from which all the stunning and persistent diversity of races in our world has sprung: Asians, Native Americans, Africans, Caucasians. We are told that these are all just shallow adaptations, the result of a few tens of thousands of years of migration and separation. But the differences, as we can plainly see, feel fundamental, deep and profound. The official story of a single Adam and Eve, or a single small tribe emerging from Africa, from which all this diversity arose, begins to seem highly unconvincing. To form such stable, drastic and lasting distinctions would seem to require hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years of complete and total isolation, not the relatively brief time that official science allows. This mystery of our own origin, of our own identity, fits perfectly into the chilling theory of a global catastrophe and a civilizational reset. And the clues for this catastrophe, the great dividing line between their world and our own, are not hidden. They are, quite literally, right under our feet all over the world, from city to city, continent to continent. We see those same imperial buildings, those same impossible structures buried. They are buried 1 or even 2 stories deep in the earth. We have all seen it. The ground floors, which we now call basements, have full-sized windows that lead nowhere, windows that look out in perfect absurdity straight into the solid ground. We see massive, ornate, arched entrances that were clearly meant to be the grand focal point of a building, now half hidden under layers of what we are told is the cultural soil, a slow, natural accumulation of debris. But it does not look like the debris of centuries. It looks like mud. It looks like clay. It looks like the uniform, settled deposit of a single, massive, liquid event. This phenomenon is so widespread, so global, and so consistent that it has been given its own name by those who dare to look: the mud flood. What if this is the scar? What if this is the evidence of the event itself? What if some global cataclysm, be it a biblical flood, the impact of a comet into the ocean, or some other mechanism we cannot yet comprehend, wiped the previous civilization of giants off the face of the earth? What if it buried their magnificent energy-producing cities under meters and meters of silt and soil, silencing their machines and ending their world in a single tragic moment? This hypothesis, this idea of a great world-ending flood in the recent past, is the one master key that fits every lock. It explains the buried buildings. It explains the sudden disappearance of the advanced technology. It explains the loss of the builders. And in doing so, it provides the most chilling answer to our question of who we are. If the cataclysm wiped the slate clean, it would have left behind a world that was empty. The cities, though buried, were still standing, vast, silent, and waiting. And so, according to this new, terrible logic, these cleared and emptied territories were then resettled with new people, us. In this paradigm, we are not the builders. We are not even the direct descendants of the builders. We are the inheritors. We are a new population, given an empty world with a ready-made, albeit damaged, infrastructure. Perhaps, in this view, the different races and peoples of our world are not the result of a slow evolutionary branching, but are, in fact, different groups of settlers placed, perhaps deliberately, in various parts of the reclaimed planet, each with its own set of basic preformed characteristics. This idea transforms our entire world, our entire history, into something unrecognizable. It recasts our civilization as something akin to a giant social experiment, a vast human farm, where we, the new humanity, live and grow within the majestic, ancient and poorly understood scenery left behind by the true previous owners. We use their homes, we walk their streets, we repurpose their power plants into churches, but we have absolutely no idea about the true purpose, the true function, or the true history of the places we call our own. We are, in the most literal sense, squatting in the ruins of a greatness we cannot even begin to comprehend. This thought, as radical and as unsettling as it is, rests in our minds. The idea that we are not the builders, but the inheritors, that we are a new people, living in a world that was prepared for us, a world filled with the majestic, silent, and incomprehensible ruins of a civilization that came before. But this new, quiet, and logical paradigm, which seems to explain the buried windows, the giant's doors, and the repurposed power plants, forces upon us the next and most immediate question. If our current civilization is a young phenomenon, a fragile recovery, and if the previous inhabitants were erased by a great cataclysm, a mud flood that wiped the slate of history clean, then where did we come from? If the grand, restored cities stood empty, waiting like immaculate stage sets, who were the actors that would be brought in to fill them? The search for this answer leads us to one of the most vast, strange and sudden phenomena of the 19th century. It is a phenomenon so large that historians have often struggled to explain it, wrapping it in the simple, comforting language of charity, social progress, and the unfortunate consequences of industrialization. But when we view this phenomenon through the cold, logical lens of our Great Reset, through the lens of a world that needed desperately to be repopulated, it ceases to be a story about charity. It becomes the one logical and necessary solution to the profound problem of the empty, waiting cities. We are speaking, of course, of the sudden, inexplicable and global appearance of hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of orphans. It was precisely in the 19th century, the very same era that produced those unnervingly empty photographs of sterile streets, the same era that saw the rebuilding of the great cities, that countless orphanages, foundling homes and charitable institutions began to spring up like mushrooms after a rain. All across the planet, the scale of this phenomenon is, in itself, almost impossible to comprehend. Official records, though often fragmented, paint a picture of a demographic crisis without a clear, singular cause. A single institution in London might report taking in thousands of infants in a single year. We see this repeated everywhere, across Europe, in America, in Russia, and even in Australia. A vast global network of institutions was rapidly constructed to house an endless and seemingly inexhaustible stream of parentless children. These were not just modest charity homes in small villages. They were very often enormous, palatial buildings, built on the same grand imperial scale as the banks and cathedrals, capable of holding thousands of souls at once. The orphan became a defining central feature of the 19th century landscape, as common as the steam engine or the gas lamp. But our quiet, persistent logic returns, as it must, to ask the simple question, where did such a colossal number of orphans come from, all at the same time? Official history, of course, offers its standard explanations. It points to the Industrial Revolution, which drew poor families from the countryside into harsh urban environments. It points to high mortality rates from diseases that swept through these new crowded cities, diseases like cholera, tuberculosis, and smallpox. It points to the social disruption of localized wars and famines. And while these factors certainly played their tragic part, can they truly and honestly account for the sheer global scale of the numbers? Wars, it is true, leave orphans, but those are typically localized tragedies contained within a specific time and place. not a simultaneous planet-wide phenomenon that lasted for decades. Epidemics, likewise, claimed many lives, but could they, by themselves, have created such a specific and profound imbalance? Could they have truly left behind millions of children with no parents, no aunts, no uncles, no grandparents, as if their entire extended families, their entire bloodlines had simply vanished into thin air? When you add up all the known conflicts and all the recorded plagues of that era, the numbers simply do not match. The scale of the problem was so immense that it seems to point to a different singular cause, a single unifying catastrophe, the very Great Reset that the buried windows and the silent smokeless chimneys have already suggested. And it is here, in this quiet space of contemplation, that the two great mysteries of the 19th century begin to merge into one disturbing yet perfectly logical picture. On the one hand, we have the majestic but lifeless ghost metropolises, the silent, towering witnesses to a bygone civilization, cities scrubbed clean and in desperate need of a new population. And on the other hand, we have these overflowing orphanages, teeming with millions of blank slate children, children who have no past, no family, and whose true origins are shrouded in a profound and convenient mystery. What if these are not two separate, unrelated phenomena at all? What if they are, in fact, two sides of the same coin? What if this endless flood of orphans was not the problem of the 19th century, but the solution? What if these children were the human resource, the raw, unformed clay, the blank slate generation that was needed to repopulate the empty territories and the waiting silent cities across the globe? This thought is monstrous in its cold mechanical logic, but it is the only one that perfectly connects the unexplained emptiness of the giant cities with the unexplained abundance of young, new, memoryless lives. This theory, as fantastic as it sounds, finds chilling confirmation in a well-documented yet bizarre chapter of American history, the orphan trains. From the mid-19th to the early 20th century, a program was run by these same charitable organisations to transport homeless children from the overcrowded, teeming cities of the East Coast. Officially, this was a social welfare program designed to find them new families and new lives in the burgeoning Midwest, but the scale, once again, is staggering. More than 200,000 children were transported and distributed, often to farms and small towns that, we are told, desperately needed labour. Eyewitness accounts from the time describe these children being lined up at train stations in small rural towns to be inspected by the local families. They were examined, chosen and taken in a manner that sounds disturbingly less like adoption and more like a marketplace. Was this merely a humanitarian mission, or was it part of that same global logistical project to resettle the empty continent? A project whose true purpose, the repopulation of a found world, was hidden behind the compassionate and unassailable guise of charity. The word repopulation itself even appears on some postcards from the era, a term that leaves no room for ambiguity. This was not just about caring for orphans. It was about a deliberate, organised process of settling territories. This logistical project, this movement of a new, unformed humanity to settle an empty continent, is strange enough when viewed through the lens of the orphan trains. But the story becomes stranger still and far more sinister as we look at how the very youngest of these new lives, the infants themselves, were treated in this new world. If you needed to repopulate a planet, you would need more than just the children who survived the cataclysm. You would need a new, steady supply. And it is here, at the turn of the 20th century, that a bizarre and unsettling phenomenon emerges, hidden, as always, in plain sight, this time at the world's fairs and amusement parks. Amid the rides, the spectacles and the vendor stalls, a man named Martin Cooney ran popular and profitable exhibits showcasing premature babies in incubators. Visitors would pay a modest fee to enter a pavilion and gaze upon these tiny, barely viable infants, displayed in long rows of glowing glass boxes. The official story, the one we are told today, is that Cooney was a hero, a pioneer of medical technology who was saving lives that would have otherwise been lost, a man whose work was so far ahead of its time that hospitals rejected him, forcing him to take his life-saving show to the midways of Coney Island and the great expositions. And perhaps this is true. But as we rest in this quiet, logical space, we must ask the simple, unsettling questions that arise. Where did such an unimaginable and seemingly endless number of premature infants come from? Who were their parents? And why were they so willing to hand over their tiny, fragile children to a showman at an amusement park? Was this truly just about saving lives, or was it, as some theorists suggest, something else entirely? Was it about acclimatizing the public, normalizing a new and deeply unsettling idea, the idea that children could be produced, that they could be displayed, and that they could be acquired, like any other commodity at the fair? This public normalization, this spectacle of children in glass boxes, may have been a necessary step to mask an even more direct and far more frightening practice that was developing in Europe. The evidence for this is not buried in a secret vault. It is once again hiding in plain sight, printed on the most mundane and most common item of the time, the postcard. In the early 20th century, a massive and now largely forgotten genre of postcards appeared, especially in France. These postcards depicted babies in the most surreal and disturbing of scenes. They were shown hatching from giant eggs. They were shown growing in cabbage patches, tended by gardeners. They were shown being delivered by storks, and even by new technologies like zeppelins and airships, as if they were cargo being shipped. We are told, of course, that this was just quirky, sentimental, vintage humour, a strange, innocent fad. And we would be happy to believe that we would be relieved to believe that. But this comforting explanation shatters the moment we stop looking at the pictures and start instead to read the text. We must set aside the assumption of humour, and we must, with our quiet logic, simply read the words that are printed openly on these cards. A chilling phrase repeats with a frightening and unambiguous regularity, particularly on the French cards. That phrase is à vendre. This translates literally and directly to 4S ale. This is not a hint, it is not an allegory, it is not a joke, it is a direct commercial offer. Once this simple, terrible fact becomes clear, the entire vast collection of these strange postcards is cast in a sinister and unmistakable new light. They were not just art, they were not just sentimental jokes, they were catalogues. One card, in shocking detail, depicts a modern baby bazaar, a marketplace for infants. It has signs like any other shop, with signs that read, "We fear no competition, everything is for sale," and the most chilling line of all, a line that confirms the commercial, non-returnable nature of the transaction. We do not accept returns. This is not a metaphor. This implies that a child is a commodity, a product. Other postcards, displaying infants sitting in baskets or crates, list their qualities as if for a target audience of potential buyers. The captions read, "I will be good, I am cheerful, I will love you." This is not a greeting. This is a product description aimed at a vast, unseen audience of childless families. Families that needed to populate their new homes in the empty, waiting cities. This discovery is the final logical piece of the repopulation puzzle. The old myths, the ones we still tell our children, the stories of being found in a cabbage patch or delivered by a stork, suddenly take on a dark and horrifyingly literal meaning. They were not, perhaps, just fairy tales. They were the symbolic cover stories, the polite societal fictions that were created to mask a real, functioning and global logistics network. A network for cultivating, producing and distributing a new population. A population destined to fill the cold, sterile, empty cities of a world that had been erased. We find ourselves then adrift in this profound and deeply troubling new reality. A world where the greatest monuments of our past, the cathedrals and palaces, seem to be the silent relics of a vanished, technologically advanced civilization. A world reset by a great cataclysm, the mud flood, that buried the giants and wiped the slate of history clean. And in the aftermath, in the 19th century, we see the evidence of the solution. The sterile, empty cities scrubbed clean, waiting like empty vessels. And we see the arrival of the new inhabitants, the blank slate generation. Hundreds of thousands of orphans transported by train, displayed in incubators and catalogued on postcards. A new population to fill the old world, a population with no memory of what came before. This narrative, born from the quiet, impartial logic of our observations, provides a deeply unsettling yet coherent framework. We have a world of impossible, giant-scaled architecture, a world that once ran on a forgotten principle of free, wireless energy. We have the evidence of a great shutdown, a deliberate technological regression that plunged humanity back into a primitive state. We have the falsified histories, the staged photographs of construction, and the repurposed exhibition cities designed to cover up this appropriation. And to populate this newly captured empty world, we have the evidence of a vast logistical operation, a repopulation program sourcing millions of blank slate orphans to become the new memoryless inhabitants. This story, as fantastic as it sounds, connects all the threads. But in accepting it, we are drawn back, finally and inescapably, to the physical scar itself. We are drawn back to the most tangible, widespread and silently ignored piece of evidence of all. The evidence that is quite literally buried just beneath our feet. We have all seen it in almost every old city in the world. It is an architectural peculiarity so common that we have been conditioned to not even see it. We walk down a historic street and we see the magnificent stone buildings, and we see windows on the first floors, windows that do not look out onto a street, but descend directly and absurdly into the ground. We see grand, ornate doorways, arches of impossible craft that now sit halfway below the pavement, their intended purpose nullified, their grandeur choked with concrete and soil. We see entire ground floors, which we now call basements or cellars, built with the same level of ornate detail, the same massive, impossible stone blocks as the floors above, a level of effort that seems insane for a room intended only for storage. This phenomenon is global. It is in Paris. It is in St. Petersburg. It is in New York. It is in Buenos Aires. The entire old world, it seems, is sinking. The official story for this phenomenon, the one you will be given by any tour guide or historian, is simple, mundane, and profoundly reassuring. It is called the cultural layer, or it is explained away as soil subsidence. Historians tell us that over many centuries, cities naturally build upon themselves. New roads are paved over old ones. Debris from life and construction accumulates, and the street level, inch by inch, gradually rises, slowly and harmlessly, swallowing the lower floors of the older buildings. It is a natural process, we are told, as slow, as gentle, and as inevitable as the turning of the seasons. It is the simple, harmless footprint of time. But as we float here, in this quiet space of contemplation, we must ask our simple, logical question. Does that explanation truly fit the scale, the speed, and the uniformity of what we see? We are not talking about a few inches of accumulation over 1,000 years. Old photographs, taken in various cities across the world, show us something entirely different, something far more drastic and far more sudden. We see majestic buildings buried not by inches, but by 5, 6, or in some cases, even 20 or 30 feet of solid earth. This is the height of an entire first or even a second floor. How could such a cultural layer accumulate so quickly? How could cities in the New World, like those in America, which were supposedly founded only 100 or 200 years prior, have accumulated a cultural layer that is identical in depth to the ancient cities of Europe? The timeline collapses. And so we must look at the photographs, not the staged construction photos, but the photographs of the cleanup. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, we see images that are not of construction, but of excavation. We see entire cities engaged in what can only be described as a war against the soil. These images raise a series of simple, logical questions that the official history of the cultural layer fails to answer clearly. If these cities were indeed buried under such a colossal, uniform volume of earth, how and by what means were they excavated? We are talking about millions upon millions of cubic yards of soil that had to be removed, all without the aid of our modern heavy machinery. This would have been a titanic, almost impossible effort, even for the age of steam engines, and the photographs show us this. They show us surreal industrial landscapes. In the middle of a once grand avenue, on a hastily laid set of temporary railway tracks, stands a huge clanking steam shovel. Scoop by scoop, it bites into the multi-yard thick layer of compacted earth, the very earth that covers the first floors of the buildings around it. It then swivels, loading this earth into the wagons of a full-sized train which waits right there on the street. Entire trains operating in the middle of cities worked like a giant conveyor belt, hauling the soil out day and night without rest. A second, equally troubling question follows. Where did all of that excavated earth disappear to? You cannot simply move a mountain of soil from the centre of a city without leaving a trace. Millions of tons of earth, dug out from around these buildings, would have had to be deposited somewhere, requiring a logistical operation comparable to the construction of the cities themselves. Yet, the historical record is strangely silent on this. There are no great records of giant man-made hills being created on the outskirts of these cities. No evidence of this massive disposal operation. The photographs, however, give us a clue. In many coastal cities, we see complex conveyor belts and railways leading directly to the harbour, suggesting this earth was loaded onto huge barges, taken out to sea, and simply dumped. And this leads to the final and most logical question of all. Why? Why undertake such a monumental, back-breaking, and unbelievably expensive task in the first place? If the ground level was now 20 feet higher, why not simply adapt? Why not accept the new ground level, seal off the buried floors, and start living on what was now the first floor? This would have been infinitely simpler, infinitely cheaper. Why was it so desperately, so fundamentally important to invest unimaginable resources into digging out these lower floors, just to turn them into dark basements and to restore the original ancient street level? There must have been a compelling, powerful reason. Perhaps the infrastructure of the old world, the power systems, the plumbing, the transport tunnels, were all at that original level. Perhaps they were not just reclaiming the facades, they were reclaiming the system. What force of nature, or perhaps not nature, could have buried entire cities across the entire globe under such a massive uniform layer of earth all at the same time. This was not a slow accumulation. This was a rapid, powerful and singular event. This is the scar. This is the mud flood. This is the physical, irrefutable evidence of the cataclysm that ended their world and began our own. To understand this event, this mud flood cataclysm, we must journey in our minds to the very cities where this excavation was most profoundly and surreally documented. Our first stop is a city on the Pacific coast, Seattle. Old photographs from this city, taken in the 19th century, immediately immerse us in an atmosphere that is not just industrial, but deeply and inexplicably strange. This does not look like a new city being built upon empty land. It looks like a landscape being uncovered, a civilization being exhumed. Imagine standing on a city street, a street already lined with solid, well-built, multi-story brick buildings, and right next to these houses, rising up like sheer, vertical cliffs, are massive walls of compacted earth. These are not gentle, rolling hills. They are sheer faces of soil, and the buildings stand at their feet as if they are archaeological artifacts just brought to light. In other photographs, the scene is even stranger. Entire houses, sometimes several stories high, stand perched precariously on top of these earthen mounds, which are nearly as tall as the buildings themselves, as if they were carefully cut out from the main landmass. One gets the distinct, unavoidable feeling that the city was literally breaking through a thick layer of earth, freeing itself from a muddy earthen prison. Now official history, of course, has an explanation for this. It is not a cataclysm. We are told of ambitious street regrading projects. In Seattle, we are told the city engineer, a Mr. Thompson, took advantage of a great fire to level the glacial hills that supposedly hindered the city's development. But this explanation, like so many others, begins to feel unconvincing, like a story crafted after the fact when we simply look at the visual evidence. Does it make sense to build your finest, most permanent brick structures first, at the bottom of a hill, and then decide to remove the multi-ton hill of earth that is towering over them? It seems like a logistical nightmare. It seems, in a word, impossible. The photographs do not look like regrading. They look like excavation, but the official explanation crumbles completely when we look not just at the what, but at the how. Alongside the steam shovels and the trains, the photographs show us another method of removal, something far more mysterious, something that does not fit the simple story of levelling hills at all. We see numerous pictures from this era, showing men looking small and fragile, holding what look like giant fire hoses or water cannons. They are aiming these powerful high-pressure jets not at a fire, but directly at the sheer vertical walls of earth that stand between the buildings. The official caption for one such photograph reads, "Regrading the streets." But this explanation, like so many others, seems to create more questions than it answers. Why, logically, would you use water? Turning tons of solid, compacted earth into a liquid slurry, a sea of mud, seems like an extraordinarily inefficient way to work. This mud would complicate the movement of all other machinery. It would create chaos, flooding the very areas you are trying to clear, requiring even more effort for its collection and removal. This method seems strange, illogical, and counterproductive for ordinary earth. But it would be the perfect and perhaps the only logical method if this earth had special properties. And it is here, as we search for an answer, that we must turn our gaze north to Alaska during that very same era. Let us recall how gold was mined there. The gold-bearing layer was often buried beneath a thick, rock-hard layer of so-called muck, a frozen mass of soil, ice, peat, and the remains of trees and animals. It was permafrost. To get to the gold, miners first had to get rid of this permafrost. And how did they do it? Digging it with an excavator was almost impossible, so they used the most effective method known. They thawed it. They washed the frozen ground away with powerful jets of water from hydraulic monitors, the exact same tools we see in the Seattle photographs. Now, let us mentally return to those surreal images from Seattle, where people are spraying giant walls of earth. With those same powerful hoses, the method is absolutely identical. This can no longer be seen as a coincidence. If the city of Seattle used the exact same highly specific, labour-intensive and messy method as the one used for dealing with permafrost, it is only logical to assume they were working with the exact same material. This insight allows us to form an incredible, yet surprisingly coherent hypothesis. What if, in the relatively recent past, perhaps in the very cataclysm that reset the world, the coast where Seattle would later be built was struck by a giant ice tsunami? This was not a wave of water. It was a colossal, moving mass of ice shards, mud, silt from the ocean floor, and the ground-up remains of everything in its path. This monstrous wave swept across the land, burying the landscape and any structures that were already there. And then, due to the enormous amount of ice in its composition, this slurry of mud and ice froze, forming what was later literally called glacial hills. This was not a true ancient geological permafrost. It was a flash permafrost, the result of a single catastrophic event. This hypothesis explains everything at once: the colossal, sudden volume of soil in the city, the strange and specific method of its removal, thawing with water cannons, and even the literal name glacial hills given to it by the engineers. This version seems to tie together all the strange facts concerning Seattle. It seems we have found the answer, but this hypothesis, as elegant and as complete as it is, has one fundamental and absolutely fatal flaw. It is shattered by geography. This ice tsunami theory, which so perfectly explains a coastal city, is absolutely helpless before the mystery of our next stop. Let us journey in our minds thousands of miles to the very heart of the continent. Let us go to Kansas City. Here, we are in a fortress of land, an island in the centre of a continent, protected from any conceivable aquatic cataclysm. It is located thousands of miles from the nearest ocean, at an altitude of nearly 900 feet above sea level. To flood this city would require a wave of such biblical proportions, a wave that would have had to sweep across half of North America without losing its power, that it defies any known laws of physics. The ice tsunami could never have reached it. And yet, the photographs show us the very same picture. We see massive stone buildings buried in soil right up to their roofs. One picture from 1867 allows us to appreciate the sheer scale of this burial. It shows the corner of a large stone building, and the soil line is at the height of 2 full floors. That is approximately 23 feet of dense earth that once covered a significant part of the city. The coastal hypothesis is broken. The cause had to be different. And so we are left with this final central paradox. The ice tsunami, which so elegantly seemed to solve the riddle of Seattle, which explained the glacial hills and the mysterious identical water cannons used in the Alaskan permafrost, crumbles to dust when faced with the geography of Kansas City. This city, a fortress of land, an island in the centre of a continent, could not have been reached by any aquatic cataclysm. We must therefore look for a completely different explanation. The cause had to be different. And once again, the old photographs themselves, those silent witnesses, give us the clue. Early images of Kansas City, taken at the very beginning of its excavation, show a very strange landscape. It is not the thick, dense, uniform silt we might expect from a water-based flood. Instead, it is uneven, undulating, almost like the frozen waves of desert dunes or underwater sandbars. This terrain does not look like it was covered by a heavy, wet mass of mud. Rather, it looks as though it was buried under a huge, suffocating mass of something loose and dry. What is also striking in these photographs is the almost complete absence of mature old trees. We see only a few young saplings, which indirectly suggests that not so long ago, perhaps just 50 years before the photo was taken, this was a practically barren area, devoid of the vegetation that could have held the soil in place. These quiet, visual observations lead us to a second parallel hypothesis. What if the central regions of the continent, the Great Plains, fell victim to a completely different element? What if these lands were hit not by water but by air? What if these cities were buried by dust and sandstorms of an unimaginable apocalyptic force? We know, even in our own modern times, that wind is a powerful geological force, capable of transporting millions of tons of sand and dust over vast distances. We know of the historical Dust Bowl in the United States in the 1930s, when monstrous storms, born of drought and poor farming, carried away the fertile topsoil from entire states, burying homes and farms. What if, in the recent past, in that same 19th century cataclysm, an event occurred that far surpassed even the Dust Bowl in its power and its scale? What if it was a series of catastrophic storms that lasted for years, or even decades, methodically lifting the very ground into the air and burying everything in its path? This hypothesis, the hypothesis of the Great Dust Storm, perfectly and elegantly explains a key feature of the buried cities that the tsunami theory could not. It explains the preservation of the buildings. A giant wave of water, or worse, a wave of ice carrying debris, possesses a colossal, destructive kinetic energy. It would not have just buried the cities, it would have wiped them from the face of the earth, smashing their stone walls into ruin. But a sandstorm, a dust storm, acts differently. It does not strike, it engulfs. Billions of tons of sand and dust, driven by an apocalyptic wind, would slowly but relentlessly accumulate against the walls of the buildings. It would bury the streets, fill the windows and cover the doors, gradually entering the city without destroying its fundamental structure. The buildings, the cathedrals, the palaces, the giants' homes, they survived intact, precisely because there was no impact force. They were encased in a kind of sandy sarcophagus, which preserved them perfectly, holding them in stasis until the day people returned to dig them out. And so, we are left with a picture that is far more complex and far more terrifying than we first imagined. Our investigation, which began with the simple question of buried windows, has led us not to one, but to two seemingly mutually exclusive conclusions. For coastal regions like Seattle, the ice tsunami hypothesis looks strikingly and logically convincing. It explains the sudden, massive volume of soil, its specific glacial character, and the bizarre yet logical method of its removal by thawing it with water cannons. It was a catastrophe born of the ocean. But for cities in the interior of the continent, like Kansas City, this version simply does not and cannot work. Here, a different element was the culprit. The undulating dune-like terrain, the absence of old trees, and the incredible preservation of the buildings point to a completely different scenario: apocalyptic dust storms, born of the air. It would seem we have found the answers, but in reality it is this very conclusion that brings us to the main, the true, and the most large-scale mystery of all. If there was not a single universal cause, if different parts of the world were struck by different but equally destructive forces, then we are faced with an even more disturbing question. What kind of single global event could have occurred on our planet, perhaps just 150 to 200 years ago, that triggered a chain reaction of such diverse cataclysms all over the world, all at the same time? This no longer looks like a series of local incidents. This looks like the symptoms of a single global failure in the planetary system. What force could have caused the oceans to overflow their shores in giant icy waves, and at the same time strip the topsoil from the continents, turning it into airborne sand and dust? This is the Great Reset. This is the event horizon. This is the cataclysm. Perhaps it was a cosmic impact, the fall of a large asteroid or comet that struck the ocean, a single terrible blow. Such an impact would, in an instant, explain everything. It would send colossal icy tsunamis, the ice tsunami, outward from the impact site, burying coastal cities like Seattle. At the same moment, it would throw billions of tons of dust, earth and water into the atmosphere, plunging the entire world into a dark nuclear winter. This sudden deep freeze, this year without a summer, would have caused the catastrophic climate shifts, the droughts and the apocalyptic winds that created the great dust storms, burying inland cities like Kansas. This single global failure is the master key. It is the one event that fits every lock, the one theory that unifies all of our quiet observations. It explains the majestic, impossible cathedrals and the giant imperial architecture. They are the silent, towering relics of the advanced pre-cataclysm world, the world of the giants. It explains the free energy, the wireless power, the silent streetcars. That was the technology of their world, a system that was broken in an instant by the cataclysm. It explains the great shutdown and the regression to horses. Our ancestors were not the builders, they were the survivors, left with the broken, defunct machinery of a world they no longer understood. It explains the empty, cold and sterile cities of the 19th century photographs. They are the ghost towns, cleansed, exhumed and restored after the disaster. It explains the sudden, mysterious appearance of millions of orphans. They were the blank slate generation, the survivors, gathered and redistributed to repopulate this new, empty, inherited world. And it explains the physical scar, the thick global layer of mud and dust that buried the world, the mud flood. The old buildings, with their buried floors, are not just architectural oddities. They are the scars on the body of our civilization, the high water mark of a cataclysm that changed the face of the planet and erased the memory of the world that came before. We have not found the final answer, but we have, at last, discovered the true scale of the question. The greatest secrets of history are not written in ancient manuscripts or locked in secret vaults. They are here, all around us. They are carved in the stone of our city halls, in the impossible proportions of our bank doors, and they are lying right here, just beneath our feet, waiting for the day we decide to stop and to truly look, sleep well, and dream of the world that was.